Welcome to episode 49 of No Rares Required. I got a little bit of feedback that I was sounding particularly scripted and like a news anchor, because I was reading a script that I wrote out for it to try to, get my points across. So this week I'm going to try something a little different. I'm a little nervous about it, but I'm going to try to do it without a script. So some of you may have come over from the budget deck list that has been my most popular video, and every week what I do is I go over a specific archetype or color pair in the current Magic the Gathering set, focusing on draft. And I like draft because it's the easiest way to, or I guess the most cheap way to be free to play and collect all of the cards. So this week I'm going to cover what I'm going to call Orzhov Stockpiles, which is it's an aggro-control build. You can take it several different ways, right? Like every archetype, you can always go one way or another as far as aggro versus control or attrition. And generally, for those who are new to Magic, aggro is trying to win by turn 5, where by turn 5 you only have 15 mana to use, and so you're trying to get the game over before your opponent has used all of their cards in their hand. Whereas control or attrition is trying to have some sort of inevitability to win the game the longer it goes, and they're just trying to survive until turn 8, turn 9, where they have ample opportunity to use all of their resources. So aggro-control, also called tempo, is kind of a mixture between aggro and control. And what you're trying to do is you're playing early threats, but then you are playing more removal than you normally would in just a strictly aggro deck, with the intent of removing your opponent's stuff. So you're disrupting your opponent's plays to try to push damage through. So with that in mind, this deck is a little bit low on creatures. It has 11 creatures, at least the build that the direction I took it, and 13 if you count Hopeful Vigil. And so generally in aggro decks, you want about 15 creatures, because the way that you get enough repetitive damage through is by having enough threats on the board. But like I said, you're giving up some of that to play some more removal. So with that in mind, let's jump into the cards individually. So first up is Hopeless Nightmare. It's an enchantment for 1. That when it enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card and they lose 2 life, and then later it can trigger a Scry 2 when it goes into the graveyard, and it has the ability to sacrifice itself. But in this set, Bargain is a mechanic that allows you to sacrifice artifacts, tokens, or enchantments. So there's a couple of ways that you can get this into your graveyard without having to pay the 3 to trigger the Scry 2. So this is my top performing common for Orzhov, specifically because it performs best in the black-white archetype because it synergizes incredibly well with Stockpiling Celebrant. So Stockpiling Celebrant is a 3/2 for 3 that when it enters the battlefield, you may bounce a non-land permanent back to your hand, and if you do, you scry 2. So not only do so these cheap enchantments like Hopeless Nightmare, you can bounce back to your hand to play again, and you trigger a scry 2. And so it's this really nice synergy that makes Stockpiling Celebrant also perform the best in black-white specifically. It also performs, there are combinations with Stockpiling Celebrant that work in any white deck. So we've also got Hopeful Vigil, and this is the white version of the Hopeless Nightmares. You've got Hopeless Vigil, which spawns a 2/2 when it enters, 2/2 token with Vigilance, and then same thing when it goes to the battlefield, you can scry 2. So this is another target that you can bounce to with Stockpiling Celebrant to trigger a scry as you enter the battlefield, and then you get the enter the battlefield effect again. And both of these black and white enchantments, their enter the battlefield effect is really good for the price that you're paying. A 2/2 Vigilance for 2 is a fine creature that you would be happy to run in your curve. And then after that, there's a lot of, you want to focus on removal. So Black has one of the best common removals in the set, and it also comes with Bargain. So this is a great way to get extra value off of your Hopeless Nightmares and your Hopeless Vigils. The one downside with Candy Grapple is that it's usually gone by pick 2 or 3, so you do need to prioritize it in the draft and take it early. Cooped Up is also pretty good removal, and it goes a little bit later, around pick 4 or 5, but because it's cheap white removal, which Boros is especially interested in as an aggro deck, so you'll want to keep your eyes out for this one. Of note, one thing that you can do that's kind of interesting with Cooped Up is you can bargain it. This is more specific to Boros, but something to keep in mind. You can use instant speed bargain, and then use this in response. So you exile the enchanted creature. You have to put on full control, but then as that's resolving on the stack, you can bargain it on top of it. So you can get additional value. You can exile the enchanted creature and use it for bargain. And then we've got Archon's Glory, which is a trick that I really like in Orzhov and Selesnya, since they both have cheap rolls that you can use for bargain. So whether or not it's just like the little token that you put onto your enchantment with an aura that you put onto your creature, or you use the bargains to trigger off of like Hopeless Nightmare, Hopeless Vigil. Being able to give something +2/+2 flying and lifelink is really great for that last minute, like getting damage through, as well as winning a race if you're up against another aggro deck. And the other thing that's really nice about this is that this card wheels. So when white is open, you can find these on like pick 8 or onward. So that, very, very useful to use the resources that are available to you that people that are underdrafted. And then we also have Rat Out. And Rat Out is a pretty good way to take out your opponent's early blockers. There's a lot of X1s, 2-1s, 3-1s in the set that this can remove. And then also you get a Rat token, which you can use later to trigger some of your bargains. And so I've really liked Rat Out, not just in Rakdos, where you get a lot of synergies off the rats, but I do think you should be looking for it in Orzhov. Then we've also got Sweet Tooth Witch, and I've really liked, in black, there's a little bit of food synergies. So in Golgari is kind of like the food synergy deck, but anytime that you're in black, you have access to some cards that synergize together at common. And being able to use your food later in the game to ping your opponent for damage is especially nice if you... one of the things that you give up to have the tempo side of it, like including more control, is that the game is going to go a little bit later. So instead of winning by turn 4, maybe you're aiming to win by turn 5 or turn 6. And so that when you start getting into the later part of the curve, you run into issues that you just don't have an answer for, like Hamlet Glutton, the 6/6 trample that gains 3 life in green. So what's nice about Sweet Tooth Witch is that if your opponent has set up defenses that you can no longer get through, you can then sacrifice your food to deal damage directly to your opponent. So it gives you nice reach. And then to combo more into the food synergies is Monstrosity. And the other thing that's nice about it in Orzhov specifically, and Golgari, is that the food tokens also make really good targets for bargain in a pinch, for your Candy Grapples, for your Archon's Glory, for any of those payoffs. And so you get a 3/1, which I really like the aggressive stat blocks, right? If you're gonna be playing an aggro tempo deck, you really want to push damage through. So if you play this on turn 2 and then turn 3 or turn 4, you're using removal to push damage, you much rather have a 3/1 than a 2/1. And if they do have something like Rat Out or Flick a Coin to get rid of the 1 toughness, you at least get a food that you hopefully can leverage off of something like Sweet Tooth Witch later in the game. And then we've also got the last common that I think stands out to me is Conceited Witch. And Conceited Witch allows you to cast it as an adventure to attach a Wicked Roll to a creature. And then you can use that Wicked Roll to sacrifice later for bargains, etc., etc. It's kind of what this archetype is doing, is creating fodder for a variety of cards. And the 2/3 Menace works really well for the tempo-based strategy. If you're using your removal to get rid of your opponent's early plays, then their board is going to be small. And maybe you've heard somebody like Sam Black say, like, you're going to make it a small game, which your Hopeless Nightmares, causing them to discard, also encourages there just being less cards involved. And when that's the case, Menace goes up quite a bit in value. So I've liked Conceited Witch as well. And one thing that I'd like to finish with for the commons is that when you're playing this kind of like aggro or control or tempo, you just tweak your deck slightly and you can wind up in a very different spot. So if you look at my draft skeleton, it has 17 lands, and it kind of tops off with the 3/5 flying fairy that can sap them for 3 that we'll get to in the uncommons. And you could shave that off, and you'll notice there's only 2 4-drops. So this archetype can go really low lands. You can do like 15 or 16 lands and go for just strictly aggro, and you'll want to focus more on the 2-drop cards. So you really need enough monstrosities and things like that, because the archetype can struggle to find decent 2-drops. And that's why I think it works better as tempo. And then on the flip side of that, you could also just, deprioritize creatures and just lean heavily into black and white removal and play an attrition game. So a lot of flexibility in this archetype specifically. And then for the uncommons, Imadane's Recruiter is a broken card. It's one of the top performing uncommons. It's performing too well for an uncommon. And so when you have, you're already going to have access to white, so you can just play this as a 2/2. As 2 2/2s for 5, which is okay. But you can also splash off of like Crystal Grottos or Prophetic Prisms, make pretty good bargain targets later since they draw a card when they ETB. So you've got access to some fixing in this set, and splashing for red for Imadane's Recruiter, if you do happen to pick one up, is definitely something to keep your eye out for. If you're completely over in like black green, you're a little less likely to splash Recruiter. But anytime that you're in white or red, you definitely should be looking to splash Imadane's Recruiter. It's so good. And I think that one of the things that I would like to do is kind of have an exchange back and forth. So if you have something that you would like to comment about, like what you really like in the archetype, I'd love to hear from you. And one of the things that I think is an interesting point to talk about is what would you do to change Imadane's Recruiter to a more balanced card? So thoughts, you could make it into like 1 double pip red, so that it's harder to splash. I've thought maybe it would have been better if it had haste specifically and then gave all of your creatures +1/+0 instead of giving everything haste as well, because then you can't do train the troops and then attack with 3 3/2s with haste. So you'd have to kind of do the train the troops the turn before and then do the Recruiter, which will give your opponent a little bit of time to respond. But anyway, I'd love to hear back from you. And the other mythic level uncommon, so an uncommon that's performing as well as like the mythic rares, is Ariet's Tempting Apple. And it performs best in Orzhov, and I really like it in the tempo or the aggro-control build, because you are playing that small game, so removing your opponent's blocker and turning the opponent's blocker into a threat is fantastic. And these cards are part of the reason why with the adventures and cards like this, like, you have a lot of stuff to do with your mana. So that's part of why I went with the 17 lands instead of like 16 or 15. Is I really don't think this is the set where you're trying to just get as many, tweak the lands down to get more threats in, just because I've never found a lack of resources. But for like this, you can use it for 6 to not only take over and threaten, take over one of your opponent's creatures, but then you can also hit them for 3 damage. So this card just wins you games as long as you're aggressive enough to get their life total down. Where this really struggles is when your opponent has too wide of a board for you to take something and actually get in meaningful damage. All right, we've also got some pretty good selection of uncommons in Orzhov. So Shrouded Shepherd is right at home. You can cast the adventure side, which is absolutely devastating if your opponent has a whole bunch of 1/1 rats. And then a 2/2 that comes in and gives something +2/+2 is really good in an archetype that's trying to push pressure, right? So as long as you have something that's unblockable, whether it has menace or flying or whatever, a 2/2 that enters, a 2/2 for 2 that enters and hits for 2 damage is fantastic. We've got Woodland Acolyte, which Also, these adventure cards, you can bounce with Celebrants to replay the adventure side as well, so you can get additional value. So you could look to, like, if you're already going to be splashing for Eldraine's Recruiter, you might have access to playing the green side of this card, which allows you for 4 to bring something back and then draw it immediately into your hand. Otherwise, though, it's just a 2/2 that enters the battlefield and draws a card. Generally, creatures that enter the battlefield and draw a card have done very well, and Woodland Acolyte is no exception. And it's an okay target to bounce again with Celebrants, but do keep in mind that you want to make sure you're not negatively affecting your tempo. So if you're going to do this, you definitely are leaning towards the attrition side of things and trying to make the game go longer if you're trying to get the value off of bringing this back to your hand to draw again. So just keep it in mind. Most of the time, I think in this, at least in my build where I'm approaching it with a tempo strategy, you don't want to bounce Acolyte back to your hand with stockpiling Celebrants. This card, on the other hand, is one that you definitely want to bounce back to your hand. So Princess Takes Flight exiles a creature and then gives creature +2/+2 and flying in Chapter 2. And then in Chapter 3, returns the exiled creature back to the battlefield. And if you're in a really aggressive strategy like Boros, you don't even need to get rid of anything. You can just like win the game off of the +2/+2 and flying, and you don't worry that their card comes back into play. But with this strategy, you've got a couple of options. So not only do you have cards that do bargain, like Candy Grapple and Archon's Glory, where you can use this after it gives something +2/+2, then you can use it's great to target it with bargain because your opponent won't get the creature back unless Chapter 3 resolves. The other thing, too, is that you can play Stockpiling Celebrants, and this is kind of an old combo by now, right? We're going deep into the format. But you can bring Princess Takes Flight back to your hand to do it all over again. So the magic number for cards like this, in my mind, my goal is to have at least 5. So like with Hatching Plans, very similar, you want at least 5 things that trigger bargain. And for Princess Takes Flight, you can count Stockpiling Celebrants as part of that cards that give you bargain. So I think in my build, between Candy Grapple and Archon's Glory and the Stockpiling Celebrants is well over 5. So you have options to make it work, and you should definitely be looking to do so. And then we've got High Fae Negotiator, which you do need some sort of threat in case the game goes long. It's another nice payoff. It comes with bargains, so you can get rid of your Hopeless Nightmares, your Hopeless Vigils. And then ping 3 and gain 3 is really nice. It stabilizes you if you are in a race. And then a 3/5 flyer is a pretty decent threat that can push damage through to kind of end the game if it does go to turn 5. Witch's Vanity is one that I don't think I included it in my draft skeleton, but I did consider it. It's, the downside with Witch's Vanity is when you draw it later in the game, because Chapter 1 destroys a creature with mana value 2 or less, and then creates a food token and creates a wicked roll. So the nice thing about this is that it's 3 cards, it's bargain fodder, in 3 cards in 1. And you're not really going to be looking to bounce it with Stockpiling Celebrants, but you can. And it's just good removal at the beginning of the game. So something to consider if you do open it. And then we've got Fairy Dream Thief I've really enjoyed in Orzhov. It's really great in Rakdos when you can give it a young hero roll and eventually make it into a 4/4 flyer. But it gives you Surveil when it comes into the battlefield, which can be really nice because you really don't want to struggle in aggro and tempo strategies. You want to curve out, you want to hit your land drops and make those plays. So Surveil can be really good for smoothing out your draws and hitting the lands that you need. And then later in the game, if it does die, you can exile it for 3 and draw a card, which can be good if it starts to come into the attrition side of things where value really starts to be important. And the Threadbind Click, I think, is fine to play, even if you don't want to splash for blue. Having the 3/3 flyer for 4, having the Phantom Monster is okay. But being able to destroy target tapped creature at instant speed for 3 is really great. And just the other day, I came up against somebody who was playing 4 of these, and it's just like it's one of those that it can be so frustrating for your opponent. It's just every time that they tap in to attack you, you just like, yep, I have the answer. Yep, I have the answer. Lord Skitter's Butcher I've really enjoyed. It's not quite as much of a win condition as Eldraine's Recruiter, but if we are going for that small game, giving all of your creatures menace can just win you the game. So it is a quasi-win condition. And then it also helps you with just going wide in general, because it's a 2/3 that spawns a 1/1. And then if they have done something like put Cooped Up on one of your creatures, you can use it, and you can use the second ability to sacrifice it and draw a card. So the versatility of this card is really what makes it playable in pretty much any black deck. And then Spellscorn's Coven I like because of the small game effect. So if you don't have the Hopeless Nightmares, then I value Spellscorn Coven quite a bit less. And when it enters the battlefield, you get a 2/3 flyer for 4 that when it enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. So between your Hopeless Nightmares and this, you're attacking your opponent's resources, so that if they are on a mid-game strategy, it just starts their tools start to disappear. And then the last uncommon to keep your eye out for is Gingerbread Hunter. It's another one that, like, if you're playing Crystal Grotto does better at splashing the adventure side, the cheap cards, than it does at doing something for 5, right? So with Crystal Grotto, you'd have to pay 6. But using a target creature gets -2/-2 at instant speed has been a fine thing to include, especially if you're on that attrition plan and can spend a lot of time until you find that green source for 5/5. And now for the rares, we've got quite a few as well. We've got Spellbook Vendor, which is great in every white archetype. It's a 2/2 vigilance that at the beginning you can pay 1 and create a sorcerer roll. And this archetype is looking to create those rolls for bargain fodder. And we've also got Regal Bunnycorn, which I think performs the best in Orzhov specifically. Because each of those bargain fodders that you're creating are all non-land permanents. So I've played against opponents who slammed the Regal Bunnycorn in Orzhov and in Celestia too. And it's just like a 6/6 for 2. So it can get absolutely huge. I'm going to skip over the Lord Skitter Sewer King. I find that it's great in every black deck. If you open it, you run it if you're in black. But it is best in Rakdos. And then we have Gumdrop Poisoner, which I've found performs best in Dimir Control. But especially if you are in a control side of things in Orzhov, then Gumdrop Poisoner is just fantastic. Removal on top of removal, and it creates a food token, which if you have the food synergies with like Sweet Tooth Witch and Monstrosity, is very nice. But the rare that I decided for my draft skeleton was Devouring Sugarmaw, and it's because it performs best in Orzhov by a dramatic margin. If you are not in Orzhov, if you are in any other black archetype, you really don't want Devouring Sugarmaw. So Devouring Sugarmaw is one of those that you open and you're like, okay, it's time for black-white. The adventure side is white, creates a 1/1 human token and a food token, so you get 2 bargain targets and 1 card, and then later it comes in as a 6/6 menace trample. But you really need that fuel, because at the beginning of your upkeep you have to sacrifice that fuel, otherwise you have to tap Devouring Sugarmaw. But with the go small game plan of Orzhov, Devouring Sugarmaw fits right in. Werefox Bodyguard also really fits the tempo strategy. It's a 2/2 flash that when it enters the battlefield, you exile another non-fox creature until it leaves the battlefield. So like Brutal Cathar, if you play Dirty Constructed. And then you can also tap 2 and sacrifice it to gain 2 life. And what's really nice about this one, I think it fits best in the Azorius archetype because of the synergies between counterspells and flash. So if you're holding up a counterspell, they don't play anything that you want to counter, you then bring in a 2/2. But it works really well in a tempo-based strategy. Remove a problematic blocker, also develop the board for additional pressure. And we've got Archon of the Wild Rose, which I think performs slightly better in green-white Celestia, but is a reason, if you do pick it up in pack 1, pick one to lean more heavily into Conceited Witches if you are going to do the black-white approach, to get more of those wicked rolls. But honestly, a 4/4 flyer for 4 is a decent stat block in and of itself. And for the Mythics, we've got Virtue of Persistence. And this one's really great because it comes with a sorcery speed adventure that gives -3/-3 and gains 2 life. So it's very handy if you were being out aggroed. And then for 7, and another reason to be kind of on that 17 lands plan, if you do open up the Virtue of Persistence, is at the beginning of your upkeep, you get to put target creature card from a graveyard, including your opponent's, onto the battlefield under your control. This is not a card specific to Orzhov. It is a top-performing black mythic. So if you open this up, try to figure out how to play it. It's an absolutely amazing card. And then the last card to cover is Virtue of Loyalty. And because of the double Virtue, I was almost tempted to call Orzhov Virtue. I think Stockpiling Celebrant is more key, but either way, it could even just be Orzhov Enchantments. But Virtue of Loyalty is great because you've got an instant speed 2/2 that you can create on the adventure side, and that really catches people off guard. Like, you don't do anything on 2, and then you flash this in and block something of theirs that doesn't kill the 2/2, right? You like eat a 1/1 rat, you eat a 1/2, and then it gives you that vigilance that can apply pressure but also leave up good defenses. And then you can pay it for 5, which is reasonably costed, to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. And then it also gives pseudo vigilance because it untaps your creatures at your end step. So it won't allow you to play around the click, destroy your tapped creature, but still an amazing mid-game threat as well. Just this needs to be destroyed, otherwise your board is just going to grow out of control. So thank you for watching to the end of the video. I hope it does help you get those trophies and draft infinitely. Let me know if you liked the approach of winging it a little bit more than reading from a script. I know that the length of the video is a little bit longer because I was naturally going to wander a little bit more. But I love to hear from you guys. I love to hear the feedback. And I do post multiple videos a week, some constructed, some focusing on limited. So if you are interested, remember to hit like and subscribe for more Magic the Gathering content. And I'll be back next week. Every week I cover a archetype in the current set. So if you have one in mind, let me know in the comments below. And thank you all for the support.